Welcome, everyone. My name is Carmen Mazzara, and I serve as Executive Director of APSIA, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. We are delighted to have so many great APSIA students here from all over the world to hear from Nathan Luke Williams, who is the Senior Liaison Officer at UNHCR. But I would think his most important distinction, of course, is being an APSIA alumnus as a graduate of the Columbia SIPA, the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. As we go through this session, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in that chat box that you all, I'm sure, know so well from different Zoom meetings and classes. We are going to be able to record this session thanks to Nathan and the good folks at UNHCR. So if you don't capture something or you want to revisit it later, we'll be able to share that recording afterwards. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Nathan. If you have any particular needs or problems, feel free to send me a direct message. Otherwise, Nathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Nathan Williams. I'm a Senior Liaison Officer with UNHCR. I'm based in San Diego, but I've had like a career experience spanning 10 years, 11 years, working predominantly overseas. So I just wanted to share some insight into that experience. So I thought today I could just introduce you to UNHCR just in case, to make sure that everyone's familiar with the organization and its mandate. I can talk a little bit about my experience, and then I can also talk about some of the concrete ways that people can build a career inside UNHCR and get a job with UNHCR. So I am going to first share my screen, and then we will get started. All right, so a little bit about UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, also known as the UN Refugee Agency. UNHCR was created in 1950 following World War II, and that was in direct response to the situation of mass displacement in Europe following the end of the World War II. So the organization was created in 1950, but in 1951, the United Nations member states created the 1951 Refugee Convention, which forms really the basis of UNHCR's work. The 1951 Refugee Convention outlines who is a refugee and how member states of the United Nations have to engage with displaced people who are outside of their country of origin. And really, one of the core principles of the 1951 Refugee Convention is the principle of non-refoulement, which is basically you can't return somebody to a place where they're going to face harm. And this really has become a norm of international law, of customary international law. And so even if you're a member state that's not signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, you're still more or less obligated to follow that principle, which most states recognize, not all. So UNHCR's work in large part is formed around the 1951 Refugee Convention. We serve as kind of the guardian of the convention and make sure that states are implementing the practice and the guidance that's outlined in that convention. So really importantly, the 1951 Refugee Convention defines who is a refugee, and UNHCR as the UN Refugee Agency, this is our primary work, is understanding who is a refugee and advocating for the specific rights of those people outlined in the convention. Normally I would make people guess and try and discuss, but I'll just be very straightforward and say a refugee, this is the kind of shorthand definition. It's someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. One aspect that's left out of that shorthand definition is that you have to be outside of your country of origin. That's really important because UNHCR can really only advocate for populations that are outside of their country of origin using the criteria in the 1951 Refugee Convention. So that's really an important criteria. And just to say, like, this definition, it forms the basis of how a refugee status determination interview or an asylum interview is processed. Basically, each of the tenets of this definition are dissected into small tests. And in an asylum interview, you're trying to make sure that the person is outside of their country of origin. You're trying to assess whether they have a well-founded fear, and you're trying to assess if they're being persecuted based on one of these 5 grounds. So this definition actually has a very pragmatic role in that it dictates how states generally assess who is a refugee and who is not. And it also dictates how UNHCR understands who is a refugee and who is not. And that's really important also when you think about a career with UNHCR. So aside from the 1951 Refugee Convention and the mandate given to us there, UNHCR has a protection mandate that was given to us by the General Assembly, along with the statute of UNHCR in 1950. So this statute basically says that member states of the United Nations have an obligation to cooperate with UNHCR to provide international protection to refugees and to find permanent solutions for the problems of refugees. So we can talk a little bit more about that later, but those are really the 2 pillars of UNHCR's work: the 1951 Refugee Convention, which outlines how states interact with refugees, and UNHCR monitoring that and seeing how that's implemented. And then second of all, UNHCR's protection mandate, which basically dictates how states have to interact with UNHCR in the carrying out of its mandate and the 1951 Refugee Convention. So in that sense, UNHCR definitely has a very clear mandate, and they have a very clear role to play with states. And this is a reason that it's a medium-sized organization, but it's present in so many countries and has generally a strong working relationship with most governments. Aside from all of this kind of old history, in 2018, the UN General Assembly ratified and affirmed the Global Compact for Refugees. And this is kind of a new way of looking at member states' obligations to refugees and understanding how member states of the United Nations can work together to assist refugees and displaced populations around the world, and also really places an emphasis on burden sharing. That is, countries, well-resourced countries that don't have that aren't hosting big populations of refugees have an obligation to assist those countries that do host a large number of refugees and pay a very high cost for that. So just a little bit of background on displacement and displaced people. As of this year, actually, there's 79.5 million people who have been forced to flee from their homes. This means that approximately 1% of the world's population is displaced. This is a really sad statistic, and unfortunately, it means that UNHCR is a growth industry, and there's always a lot of work for UNHCR and international organizations that focus on refugee protection. One interesting part of the statistic to see is that 45.7 million out of the 79 million people are internally displaced. So these are people that have been forced to flee inside their country, and they have not crossed an international boundary. This is really, really important because UNHCR's mandate and the protections under the 1951 Refugee Convention actually don't apply to people that haven't crossed an international border. So, and there are other protections for IDPs, internally displaced people, but it is a different ballgame and it's a different way of working. And that's mostly done under the coordination of OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which is another UN agency or UN entity. So you can see here kind of how the situation of displacement is going. Unfortunately, like I said, it's getting worse every year. So it's not, the situation of refugees is not being resolved. Initially, when UNHCR was created, the founders of the agency assumed that within 5 or 6 years, the situation of refugees would be more or less wrapped up, and then the UNHCR could cease existing. But unfortunately, that is not the case, and UNHCR continues to have their mandate renewed, and they continue to receive significant funding and have significant work around the world. So I think it's also important to note where refugees are, because this is where the work of UNHCR is with refugees, and also who these populations are. 80% of the world's displaced people are in countries facing acute food insecurity and malnutrition. So that can give you a clue as to the situation of refugees in those countries. If the host population are facing those issues, you can be sure that the refugees are as well. Despite some of the rhetoric you might see in the media in the United States or internationally, 73% of displaced people are hosted in a neighboring country. So the top 5 hosting countries: Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and actually for the first time ever, Germany has made the list. So in general, I mean, we think of refugees as people that are traveling through many different countries to get to their final destination, whether that's the United States or France or Germany. But in reality, most people are displaced and immediately cross the nearest boundary, and they stay there. So, and those countries that are next to situations of displacement are the countries that have to that have the obligation to assist refugees and also usually pay the cost for assisting refugees, which is why the Global Compact is really so critical. Germany made the list actually because, as we all know, during the Europe refugee crisis, they admitted approximately 1 million refugees. And that action actually put them for the first time on the top of the list. This, unfortunately, is a little bit of an outdated map, but I just wanted to give you a kind of scope of UNHCR, which is to say it's massive. I think UNHCR works in approximately 136 countries worldwide. So basically, if there's a country, we're probably there. This is definitely an outdated map because when you look at Latin America, Mexico, and even the United States, we've opened so many offices due to the Venezuela crisis and also due to displacement from Central America. But the one thing that I should really, really emphasize is that the work of UNHCR is in the field. I think only 10% of the 9,000 employees work in HQ. So some people spend their entire career, their entire adult lives living and working in the field in remote duty stations. And that's because that's where the most displaced people are. There are, of course, opportunities in headquarters and New York, but the work of UNHCR is in the field. And it's really important to think about that when you decide whether you want to work for UNHCR or work in refugee protection, where you'll be working. And this is the 2019 budget by region. This budget is not a real budget. This is what we would like to have. There's no way that UNHCR has ever had even close to $8.5 billion. However, UNHCR, being a medium-sized UN agency, receives approximately $3 billion a year, I would guess, and almost $2 billion of that comes from the United States every year. So it's a significant portion of our funding comes from the United States, depending on the year and the emergency situation. But actually, we had our highest level of donations from the United States last year in 2019. Okay, so that's the general overview of UNHCR, the organization, who we assist, and how we assist them. I wanted to talk a little bit now about my experience and some concrete ways that you could potentially get a job with UNHCR. So just to give, I'm just a regular American person from Sacramento, California. I didn't know anybody. My parents don't know anybody. There was no connection. I know there's a lot of people talk about who works for the UN, and it feels like it can be a little bit nepotistic, but actually there is space for people that don't have a connection to the international world to get a job with the UN. Now, it takes a lot of luck and maybe a little bit of strategy, but it's possible to do it. So first of all, before I went to SIPA, I wasn't sure where I wanted to go to school, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to do international work, and I knew I wanted to do something that was impactful. So in my mind, I just kind of thought, oh, maybe I'll work for the UN. I mean, it sounds ridiculous now, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it, but that was really the thinking. So I, researched which UN agencies looked interesting to me, and the two that popped in my mind were the UN Refugee Agency, because I was very interested in migration generally, and then also UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, because development at the time I went to grad school, which was like 2007, 2010, was really one of the main ways that the public sector engaged with, with assisting people and helping developing countries. So I thought, well, if I want to work for those, where should I go to school? And I researched graduate programs, and I felt that Columbia SIPA had the closest proximity to the United Nations, because it was in New York. There was a number of faculty that worked with the UN. So I thought that that would be the best bet, which was both true and also not true, by the way. I mean, let's just say that, yeah, there are lots of opportunities, but nobody's walking into an internship with the UN, and there's no guarantee of where you go to school helping you get that. But it's true that being in New York was definitely advantageous for my ability to intern at the UN. So I, was a first-year student. I had very little experience that was practical or pragmatic in the field of international relations. And so I just started sending emails out to different UN offices. I, for the most part, got literally nothing back. But I sent, in the old UNHCR website, you could send a question to a field office, and I thought, I'd like to work in Ethiopia. That seems interesting. So I literally wrote a small email Dear Sir, Madam, I would like an internship. Thank you so much. And I sent it. And of course, you would expect that you wouldn't get anything from that. But apparently, it slowly made its way to the right person. And months later, I mean, really months later, somebody wrote back and they're like, hey, could you send us your CV? Which my CV was empty. Basically, I had very little practical experience. And then finally, in September 2008, they came back and they're like, congratulations, you're being offered an internship. It literally they offered me an internship September or August 30th. I had to be at school in 3 days. I was in California traveling back, and I was like, what? What do you mean? They offered me a fall internship outside of the typical summer schedule. And so I had to make a really quick decision to understand whether I would pursue that. And I decided that it was probably such an opportunity that I should take a leave of absence from my graduate program and pursue that internship for 6 months, which is what I did. And it really was a life-changing experience. I got to Addis, I worked there for 6 months, and it really changed that kind of practical experience in the field, doing core work of UNHCR really changed how I engaged in graduate school, the coursework that I took, and of course, my career trajectory. So I did that for 6 months. I came back to SIPA, and then because I worked for UNHCR, it was really easy to get another internship with the UN. So then I did my internship with UNDP. I did that for about 6 or 7 months. I enjoyed that, and I made some lasting connections, but it became very clear to me that I really wanted to work in an organization that's connected to direct services. Where you're actually every single day helping individuals, people, families, communities. And that's one of the beautiful things about UNHCR. Even though it's this big organization, there's a lot of policy and legal aspects to it. A lot of the core work is interacting, interviewing, and engaging with individual refugees every single day. I think my first day in Addis, my supervisor handed me 25 case files, and she's like, okay, you need to go out and counsel the refugees. And I was like, counsel the refugees on what? And she was like, don't worry, the refugees will tell you. They'll tell you exactly what you need to do. They'll give you the orientation. And true to her word, they did that. This is probably not the talk that I should be giving, but just to say that, that is kind of the life in an organization that focuses on emergencies and humanitarian situations. Oftentimes you're going to be put in a situation where you may not feel that you're the best qualified, but you're there. So you need to step in. And that, in that way, working for UNHCR has been a brilliant and moving experience. And yes, the answer to everything is the refugees generally know, and they'll tell you what to do. So thank God for them. So yeah, so after that, then I had another summer. So because I took the semester off, so then I did another internship with UNHCR, this time in resettlement in Malaysia. And I actually turned down a number of paid internships because I realized that while that would have been nice, really what I wanted was the work experience with UNHCR in order to get a job with UNHCR. And I also picked strategically the function that I was doing, and I'll get to this in a little bit, because there's so many jobs related to refugee resettlement, and that's what I was doing in Malaysia. So I turned down that opportunity to be financially solvent in order to get the job with UNHCR later. It all ended up working out, but it is a little bit of a gamble. Now internships are paid. So hopefully none of you will ever have to make that. Internships with UNHCR are paid. Not every UN agency are paid, but hopefully you'll never have to make that decision because it's obviously not cheap to move to a country and pay for your apartment and yourself for months on end. But I really felt like that was what needed to be done in order to get the job. So after I finished my internship in Malaysia, I came back, finished school at SIPA, and then within a few months, I was offered a job with UNHCR in Ethiopia, where I had done my first internship doing resettlement. So because I had worked for UNHCR in Ethiopia before, and then because I had gained the skill set working in resettlement, I was able to get this entry-level position through one of the hiring schemes, which I'll go into a little bit later, the United Nations Volunteer Program, and that was really what set me up for that career. So yeah, that was my first paid job with the United Nations, and it was great. And from there, I was a UNV for 1 year in Addis, and then I became a junior professional officer funded by the US State Department in Nepal for 2 years, and then in Bangladesh for 8 months. And then from there, I became a regular staff member, which is where I am today. So, you know, working for the UN or the UNHCR, it's not an easy game, but you really have to make sure that you're prepared when the opportunity arises, and you have to set yourself up to be ready to, with the right skill sets, with the right connections in order to get the opportunities that you want. So I'll go into like more details now. And I'm speaking about UNHCR, but some of this will apply to the UN in general. So UNHCR is a big or medium-sized UN organization that has big functioning offices all over the world. There's a number of core activities and ways that we engage with governments, with refugees, with host communities. And generally, they look for a few specific profiles when they're hiring people. The first and foremost is law. Like the UNHCR loves lawyers for whatever reason. They're obsessed with them. I'm not a lawyer. I studied anthropology and international affairs. I'm assuming most of the people on this call are not lawyers, so that's out for us. But there's other things to do. Really importantly, even though I was not a lawyer, while I was at SIPA, I took 3 law school classes, which was easy to do. I took refugee law, I took nonprofit management, and I took immigration law, which were all, which I thought would give me, if I couldn't go to law school, at least I could think in legal terms about those subject areas, and that was actually very useful. The other standard hiring profile is political science. So a lot of the jobs will say you should have a JD or a degree in political science. So most of us who are studying international affairs, that we can fall into that profile. And oftentimes the political science will be listed as like international affairs or international studies. So you made the right decision there. But just because you have the right degree doesn't mean that you have the right coursework, and you have to really think about what classes you want to take in grad school to set you up for that. Because your standard course of study in political science isn't necessarily going to prepare you for a work doing direct services and humanitarian response. So just be strategic about the classes that you take and what you're thinking about taking. Social work, I actually was admitted to do a dual degree with SIPA and the School of Social Work. I didn't end up pursuing the degree because I got admitted too late, and I would have had to stay for another year, and I didn't want to do that. But if you can do a dual degree in something like international affairs with something that provides a skill set like social work, public health, like even accounting, I mean, any of those kind of raw, like core skill sets will give you something else to build your profile. So I would definitely recommend that. And if not, just make sure that you take some classes that lean into skill sets that would be useful. Definitely public health is huge right now, and public health in general is always a skill set that comes in handy. Data, anything data related, data management, there's always going to be a huge demand. And of course we don't talk about it, but a lot of organizations, I mean, we all need to have finance, accounting people, all of those things. So understanding how that works, particularly if you're interested in the program management side of things versus like being a protection officer like I am, it can be really, really useful to understand how that works and getting a skill set there. So I mentioned previously some core UNHCR activities. Because we are this direct service organization, we have 3 profiles that are in almost every big operation. We have staff that do these things, and that is refugee registration, refugee status determination or asylum interviews, and refugee resettlement. And this is kind of our case management pipeline. So refugees will be displaced from an area, we'll set up a transit center, we'll get some information from them, we'll schedule them for a registration interview, which is like a long interview where we get all their basic bio data, take some photographs, perhaps there's biometric data collected, and learn a little bit about why they left and also who their family members are. Second of all, generally in this pipeline, we'll also have a refugee status determination interview. This is what we would call in the US an asylum interview done by the government. And this is where you're assessing whether an individual and perhaps their family are refugees or not. So until this moment, they're more asylum seekers. And so that we have a core of staff that do asylum interviews and RSD interviews. And third and finally along the list is refugee resettlement. That has been, of late, refugee resettlement has been really diminished, but it seems like there's going to be more opportunities for refugee resettlement. The US is the biggest receiver of resettled refugees in the world. I think, yeah, in general, I mean, they've resettled hundreds and thousands of people. So there's usually a big need for people that can do refugee resettlement interviews. So these three core activities are places and things that UNHCR desperately needs staff. So they're always looking for registration staff, they're always looking for RSD staff, and they're always looking for resettlement staff because we have targets and quotas and there's a new situation, we need to get everyone registered, we need to get them asylum process. Not every office actually works in this way, but that's kind of the standard framework. So when you think about how to get a job with UNHCR, I think thinking about what UNHCR does and trying to gain some skill sets that are related to those core activities are really vital. Refugee registration, although it's really just doing like an intake interview, actually a lot of the role of somebody working in registration is data management, because then all of a sudden you have all of this data and you're trying to understand the population. So anybody that's good with IT skills, that understands data protection, that understands how to, ping this data, how to put it together and paint a picture of the displaced population, those are really huge skill sets, and it's a really dynamic career. Refugee status determination, generally one would imagine that it's mostly lawyers doing this, and that's true, but I did RSD for 2 years in Nepal. So, and like I said, you have to kind of be in the right place at the right time. I don't love RSD, nor do I love resettlement, but they're really core functioning parts of UNHCR, and it really, and I'm glad that I've done all three of these roles, and it taught me how UNHCR works, but more importantly, there were jobs there. Like they hired me to do those things because they needed people to do them. So, you need to think about what are the core activities and how you can make sure your profile matches that of what the organization is doing. I should just say that, well, no, I'll go into that later. Okay, core skills for UNHCR. This is kind of like a dream applicant. You would be able to read and write proficiently, like very well. The better you can write, the better your critical reading and skills are, the better you'll do. The working language of UNHCR is English, so being able to write concise, pithy, like policy documents and memos, it really makes a huge difference, and there's a lot of space for that. So if you can demonstrate your ability to write, generally offices will look really favorably on that. You have to be proficient in a UN language. That is just a mandatory part of working for UNHCR and the UN in general. There are, I believe, 6 UN languages, and you have to be proficient in at least 2 of them. English is the working language for most United Nations agencies, not all of them, but most of them. So obviously English is the first, and then if you have another UN language, I mean, not that other languages aren't important or useful or helpful, but really in order to manage the bureaucracy, you do need to be able to check off that you speak Mandarin, Spanish, French, Russian, Arabic, or English, right? So if you're going to invest in studying a language, and if you want to work for the UN or UNHCR, you should definitely do that. You should pick a UN language. And if you already speak 2 or 3, like that's amazing, and you'll be able to use that skill set all the time. Data is becoming more and more important every day. So if you're able to understand how data works, to visualize data, to analyze data, that's always going to be a huge skill set, even if you're not working in registration or information management. oddly, one of the skills that I've needed to use in every single job is survey development and implementation, like based on core social science methodology. This is something that we do all the time. And if you're able to do that and understand how it works, it's very useful. So it's literally something that I draw upon in literally every day and also in every single assignment I've had. We are not lawyers, but understanding the legal context is important for an organization like UNHCR that has a legal mandate. So getting familiar with the basic legal terminology and procedures around that surround refugees and displaced people is really important. And another one, like I mentioned, those 3 core skills of UNHCR, they're really focused on direct engagement with refugees. So if you can demonstrate that you know how to interview people and you know how to interview refugees and you have experience doing that, it's really, really useful. Standard terms of reference. These change all the time, but a lot of the things that I've done have involved either legal protection, community-based protection, which is kind of working with communities to empower them to protect themselves. I don't mean physically protect them, but to advocate for their rights and to identify any problems and concerns and bring them up with UNHCR or the government. Child protection is another huge area that UNHCR works in, and that's where the various aspects of the 1951 Refugee Convention that relate to children and also other international conventions like the Convention on the Rights of the Child come together, and so you can advocate for refugee children. Case management, like a core social work skill, policy development, managing like the distribution of humanitarian assistance, like, you know, thinking of the, you know, all the people sitting on trucks handing out like different boxes and non-food items and core relief items. That's like really a standard skill set, and if you have some experience doing that, it's great. Coordination, running meetings, now they're all on Zoom, like that's always going to look good if you've held a job doing that. And protection monitoring, which is really actually the sociology methodology I was discussing earlier to do surveys and those kind of things. So there's really so much to do in UNHCR. Your job can't, like, that's why it's such an exciting career, because we have a mandatory rotation policy. You will rotate every 2 to 5 years, no matter what, and you're going to be doing something different every time probably. So it is really, really exciting. It's properly international, and there is, yeah, more so than any other UN agency, we really embedded the mandatory rotation. But you also have to think about that too, because that means you're going to be moving every 2 to 5 years. What does that mean for your personal life? You know, what does it mean to have your job and your skill set change like every 2 to 5 years? So, you know, there are things to think about in that. And I think one thing, it's really important that when you work for UNHCR, you have to have a genuine interest in working with refugees and displaced people, because it is, I mean, it's a sacrifice in some way. So I mean, it's of course well paid and well compensated and all of those things, but your personal life is not going to be like anyone else's. So you need to think about that. And you really, like, a lot of people join UNHCR and they expect that they're going to sit in Geneva, and that's not going to happen. Or for very, very few people that happens. I worked in Geneva for 3 years, but I was working on the Europe refugee crisis. I was literally in Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, Macedonia, like every month for 1 to 2 weeks. So, which is really exciting, but it's also really exhausting. So, you know, you need to think of that is a really important thing that I think a lot of people that are entering the field, it sounds really exciting. It is really exciting, but it's a sacrifice on some level. So think about that when you're planning your career. Another thing to think about in UNHCR, there's really 2 pathways. There's a generalist versus a specialist. I'm kind of on a generalist pathway. The generalist pathway is actually a little bit better longer term, because you get to work on so many different things and you kind of just get channeled into management. But then there's also the as a specialist, you have a specific skill set, and it's actually much easier to get the job as a specialist and to be hired, you know, from graduate school as a specialist. So a lot of people, you know, start off as a specialist and try and work their way as a generalist. I can't tell you which way is the best way to do it. Best of luck to you. But generally, like there's a lot, like if you're a public health specialist or you're an asylum specialist, then it's going to be quite easy to get a job right off the bat, but it's not going to be easy to leave that track in the same way. So another thing to think about is if you follow the specialist track, you have to always be looking for opportunities to prove that you have a skill set beyond that specific thing, whether that's management or writing or, finding your way to get to dabble into other projects, so that way you're not basically stuck in a very technical function and it's difficult to move out of that. Also, UNHCR, we work in two real contexts, which is the refugee camp context and the urban context. The way we work in those two fields is often very different, not completely. So yeah, I mean, you will almost certainly, if you want to work for UNHCR, end up spending a significant time working in a refugee encampment, which is not always the happiest place, and it can be a little bit sad, and it's challenging work. So you need to think about whether you're going to focus on camp-based activities or urban activities. I mean, that will come up as you get into UNHCR. Sorry, I'm like kind of rambling now. Okay, so general advice that I give to people that want to work for the UN in general, UNHCR included, really identify your specific passion or interest. Like a lot of people approach me like, oh, I want to work for the UN. I'm like, what do you want to do for the UN? It's massive. Like you need to think like, is your passion refugees? Is it child rights? Is it reproductive health? Is it political affairs? I mean, you need to think what really interests you and find the UN agencies that do that function and focus in there. The UN, it's like saying you want to work for the federal government, I mean, of the United States. Like you could work for the post office or you could work for Homeland Security. I mean, there's so many different things. So really, you're going to be the most successful if you find an area that really interests you or really moves you, and finding the UN agency that does that thing. But all that caveated, you have to be a little bit strategic, because not every UN agency hires en masse, and some of them can be very difficult to get. So identify a few that would be interesting you, and explore pathways there. Take strategic coursework. I really think, I mean, it is really important that you tailor your skill set in graduate school to get the most out of it. And that includes like broader, like regional conversations, but also like public health or, gender-based violence, like understanding concepts and things that you'll be dealing with every day. So I really recommend for policy students to dabble in the School of Public Health, or to go to the law school or the School of Social Work and take a few classes there, because you will really draw on those tangible skill sets when you're in the field. The second language is imperative. Like, just do it now. Learn it as soon as you can and get to an intermediate level. It's really, really vital. If you don't speak a second language, it will continue to haunt you, and it'll be very difficult to move up in the UN. Yeah, internships, volunteers, networking, study abroad. Like, get as much international experience as you can. And really, I can't reiterate this. Like, in order to work for the UN, you have to work for the UN, which means you need to get an internship. That is really the fundamental basis. Like, I mean, there are other ways to do it. There's lots of other ways to do it, but I'm just giving my experience. Like, if you can get an internship with the UN agency that you're interested in, your probability of being hired will increase significantly. It's just, you'll make connections, you'll get the skill set, you'll understand how it works. And when people are hiring, they'll be like, oh, well, she's already worked here. So, I think it's really, really important to think about that. Networking. Like, I know everyone says in grad school it's kind of cheesy, but like, you actually, like, there's so many amazing people sitting around you, like some of whom have already worked for the UN, some of their parents work for the UN, like mine, all of those opportunities, and not just the UN, but international organizations or, international NGOs. Get whatever relevant experience you can and find out who knows what, who's done what, and try and get them to help you. My second internship with UNHCR in Malaysia was actually a classmate who had done that internship the summer before that helped me get connected to it, even though I had already done the first internship with UNHCR in Ethiopia. So, network and find out who's doing the work that you want to do. So specifically for UNHCR, this is a field-based organization working in the field with people in the field. So getting field experience is critical. An internship in the UNHCR office in New York or Geneva is fine, that's nice, but it really cannot compare to working in Kenya or South Africa or Brazil. If you can get that field experience, it will really make a big difference. I mean, when I'm hiring people, I would much prefer to go after somebody that has worked in the field that understands what it's like and has done the work that we do. I've already talked about that. Yeah, like thinking about how you gain experience in professional opportunities that are prevalent in UNHCR, registration, refugee status determination, resettlement, other like process-based things like best interest assessment or best interest determinations for in the resettlement process for child refugees, things like that. I mean, but you also, like, it's a little bit of a risky strategy because you're gaining a skill set that exists literally nowhere except for UNHCR, but it's how you're most likely going to get a job there. So it's not easy to get an internship. So find volunteer opportunities around you that do what UNHCR does. There's so many amazing organizations in the United States, internationally, that either help refugees, that work with refugees, and you can find a way to volunteer there and get experience doing interviews. Even if you're teaching ESL to refugee communities, like there's a way to, that way you'll be exposed to refugee populations and understand the needs, and you can talk about that experience and your motivation. It looks really good. So, you know, not everything has to be a formal internship. Volunteer opportunities are really like kind of the starting point and the back door to getting a job with the UN. It can be. Like that's like you volunteer, then because of your volunteering experience, you can get an internship. Then because of your internship, you can get a junior position, you know, so just setting yourself up strategically. There's no guarantee, of course, but that's what I advise everybody. Like, it's not just you have to do the fancy internship in Geneva. Like, you can literally find an organization that's working in Sacramento that works with refugees every day and get that experience before you go in. And it really will educate your choices and you'll be able to advocate for yourself in an interview, being like, I've worked with these populations, I understand how it goes. Yeah, I mean, I think I already talked about the relevant coursework, and I really can't reiterate, like, you're going to amazing international policy schools, network with professors, network with students, network with your friends, parents who are often connected, just find a way to do it. So I'm just gonna I'll go into more into detail into the entry points, but there's a number of different junior professional opportunities that you can follow that will help you get a full-time regular appointment with UNHCR. We talked about internships. There's the United Nations Volunteer Program. There's the JPO program. I'll go into that. Talent pools. And then also often overlooked when people are going to grad school, they want the big international career, but UNHCR works in 136 countries around the world. There's national staff that are hired in all of those countries. Like, if you're from a country that has a big UNHCR office, like, you could potentially get a job on the national level, and then there's a way that you can convert that into an international career. So, you know, I had a lot of staff that I worked with in Ethiopia and Malaysia that were national staff that were hired locally, and then after 4 years or 3 years they were able to apply internationally and they became international staff. So don't overlook that career opportunity. So internships, they're offered in literally every section. They're paid now, which is great. They're not paid a lot, but it's probably enough for you to live. The only issue with this is that they're really only in family duty stations. So you can't get an internship in Venezuela, or you can't get an internship in Iraq. Like, you have to go somewhere that is safe. UNHCR won't sponsor you in any country, in any place that's potentially a hardship location. So, you know, find the best family duty station that you can, like, for me, it was Ethiopia. Like, it was super operational. It was on the border with all these emergencies, but it's a very safe country, and I was able to get that field experience that way. The UNV program, I don't often hear it discussed, but it is really the starting point for UNHCR and for a number of UN agencies. The UNV program, I mean, I guess it kind of functions like a Peace Corps-esque program, but it's not as organized in that there's not like a 2-year commitment. And it really is much more than a volunteer opportunity. It's inexpensive staffing opportunity for a lot of agencies. Sorry, I probably shouldn't say that, but that's the reality. They're like, okay, we don't have enough money for a staff member. We need somebody that has some experience doing resettlement interviews. Let's find somebody. And they hire usually a young professional. The UNV program, it's a separate UN agency. They would be very angry with my depiction of them, so please don't tell them that I said this. But at least for UNHCR, you have to be 25 years old. The day you turn 25, sign up for that UNV profile. And really, when you're like, nobody's managing your profile, it's really all like algorithms. So when you enter in your like your data, like think about strategic keywords to put. So that way when they look for resettlement, your profile has resettlement in it, like interviews, like it comes up, like really make sure that you're positioning your profile so that it can be queried as part of a long list, and then you can, you know, make your own case for yourself as if you get to the interview process. There's no guarantee for a UNV. It's you fill out a profile, it's a black hole like everything else with the UN, and you just hope that you filled it out well enough. Also, if you're doing like an internship somewhere, they may be hiring a UNV, and like you can mention like I'm like in the international UNV program, like here's my account number, like make sure to look for it. You know, there's a way, and like, so the day you turn 25, sign up for that, and make sure you really, and think about what UNHCR or UNICEF or DPKO hires. They're looking for somebody that can do the job on the ground immediately. So that's where your volunteer experience, doing interviews with refugees, or, you know, doing best interest assessments for children, like those kind of skill sets will really come in handy to get a UNV position. The UNV position is so important because it actually, even though it's a volunteer position, it gives you a title like a staff member, and also for UNHCR, and I think for the OHCHR, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, after 4 years on a UNV contract, you are eligible to be an internal staff member. So you can apply for positions as an internal. That doesn't mean, I mean, there's no, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And doing 4 years on a UNV is literally hell. But just to say, like, if you're putting your eggs in a basket, that one at least has a entry point that's built in. And so it's really, really useful. The Junior Professional Officer Program, JPO program, this is like the Cadillac of all entry-level junior positions. Not every country has a JPO program. The United States does. They have about 4 positions a year, except for those years they like randomly don't advertise them, which is hell. So, you know, they're very small. If you're, and you have to be a US citizen, or the Netherlands has like 30 a year. You have to be Dutch, although they have one for developing countries. It is very, it's like a Western country thing to do. The UK, Australia don't have them, unfortunately, or very, very, very few and very infrequently. So if you're from a country, a European country, Japan, South Korea, United States, you're very lucky that this exists. And this for me was like the natural progression. I like was an intern, then I was a UNV, and then because I was a UNV, I applied for the JPO program. And you know, as an American living abroad doing refugee work, of course, I was like, it was easier for me to get that JPO program than somebody that wasn't already working for UNHCR. So the JPO program, if you're American or from a country that has JPOs, this is the opportunity in capital letters, and you have to set yourself up to get it. Because as a JPO, you actually have a fixed term contract. You're a regular UN staff member. You're paid for by your country. I mean, it is, and you have a budget actually for training. I think it's like $5,000 a year or something like that. So it is really the best thing that could ever happen to you, all of those in capital letters. Like, definitely look into it and try and get it. Again, it's super competitive, but if you build the right experiences, it's not as competitive as you think it would be, because there's not that many Americans or Dutch people who have like 2 to 5 years of experience working for UNHCR or for DPKO or whatever, you know, so like putting yourself in the right position means that you're much more likely to get it eventually. UNHCR also has a thing called talent pools, which are basically where they hire people with specific skill sets. So this really is the specialist function. If you can get on the talent pool and then get hired in the talent pool, like amazing. That's basically you're walking into a fixed term appointment with UNHCR, or the other UN agencies have them as well. Talent pools. You're not going anywhere nice with the talent pool, to be honest. Like, it is really like because it's to fill opportunities that other people in the organization are not pursuing. So I mean, I'm just being blunt. So you're going to be in like a rural place, probably, definitely working in a refugee camp most often than not, unless it's like a really specific skill set like water, sanitation, engineering, those kind of things. So, but who cares? Like, that's why you work for UNHCR, is to work in the field. So, you know, that is an amazing place. But that's, again, the specialist versus generalist function. Sorry, I've been talking so much. Okay, so aside from this, there's also deployment schemes. So, you know, I kind of separate the two opportunities. This is where after you have a certain level of experience, You can do like there's a surge protection capacity, there's the ICMC deployees, there's an RSD roster, there's the IRC has a surge deployment. All of that works within UNHCR, and basically while you're contracted by that agency, you're working for UNHCR, and this is usually to fulfill a very specific function. It's often related to refugee resettlement or refugee status determination. So again, based on that core skill set, because they need people in that are going to hit the ground running, that are going to be able to, like day 2, like schedule 3 interviews with refugees. Like it's really like it's a lot of casework, and it's on the ground, and it's immediate. IRCs functions a little bit differently than that, but they still look for specialist functions. But if you can get on any of these, it's amazing. It's a great job. You work for UNHCR, you build a relationship with both organizations, and some of them take junior staff, and some of them take more experienced staff, like the Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC. They have a tendency to take people that have like 5, 10, 15 years of experience, but ICMC has a place for junior staff that maybe if you've done like 2 internships with the UNHCR, you could manage to get on their lowest rung of deployment and, and be sent. And that's a great way to get experience and to have like a real job where you're being paid decently. Oh, I should mention, UNVs, United Nations Volunteers, you do get paid. It's not a lot. I think in Addis, my monthly salary was $2,600 a month. So like it pales in comparison to what my colleagues were making, but it was enough for me to rent and to live and even save a little bit of money. So in summary, get an internship in the field. International UNV is your back door. You should definitely fill out that profile as soon as you can and hope to get that. JPO, if you can manage it, if your country has it, and if you manage to do it, is really the best way to work for UNHCR. And don't forget about national opportunities. I'm actually an American working in the US now. I'm not on a national staff contract, but I'm kind of functioning as a national staff in this minute at this deployment. And it's a really interesting experience. So that's pretty much it from my side. I hope that made sense, and I'm definitely able to take any questions or.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
One of the questions that we have was concerning COVID and the impact of COVID, particularly on students' abilities to go get those internships in the field that you recommended. What would you recommend they do at this unusual time to still improve their competitiveness?
Well, I mean, everybody's working remotely, right? Well, there's 2 things. First of all, UNHCR, like we have to stay and deliver. So a lot of our offices are still doing their day-to-day functions, and they have to be in the field, they have to be in detention centers, they have to do all of that. Now, the UNHCR is not going to hire interns to do that, but they're actually, in a way, there's a lot more opportunities for internships because you can do it from anywhere. So you can do that internship with Ethiopia, but you can do it from New York or DC or Singapore, right? So I would say like there's still lots of internship opportunities. Is it going to be the same experience? No. Is it going to be fun? Probably not. But it's still, it's still getting that on your CV. Unfortunately, a lot of an internship is networking and building connections, and that is going to be severely inhibited by COVID-19, and there's really no way around that. But having an internship, even if it's remote, is far better than not having one. So I would continue to look for those opportunities, continue to reach out to offices and see what their needs are and see whether they're hiring people.
And semi-related to that, knowing how competitive UN internships themselves are there other organizations that you find very compelling when you see them on a resume, or organizations that students should seek out that will continue to help them build their competitiveness?
Yeah, I mean, any of the big international NGOs that do similar work to UNHCR, like if you've worked for International Rescue Committee for 2 years on a project, for me, that's interchangeable almost with UNHCR experience. So International Rescue Committee, Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC, Danish Refugee Council, DRC, really there's any number, and if you're an American student, there are also a number of international NGOs that have US operations, including IRC, including HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Catholic Charities. Any of these organizations are working on refugee resettlement issues in the US, and getting a job there it segues very nicely with an international career. And that's another pathway. You could start working locally for one of those organizations and then work your way to an international career with that organization, and then you can jump laterally over to UNHCR or another UN agency, or not, or maybe you like not having to deal with hellish bureaucracy and you enjoy your organization better. So
We appreciate you airing all of your laundry on this particular
I'm so
topic.
happy. I'm probably going to get fired.
So we have one participant on the call who has 10 or more years of experience in things like ag and water, but they're looking to pivot to working with refugees in Central America. Can you talk about the mid-career sort of pivoting process a little bit, if you know?
Yeah, I mean, for UNHCR, there isn't a lot of difference. Like, they are just excited if you have relevant experience. So you have to really, I mean, that would definitely be your way in with at that stage is a specialist function. Like, how can you, like, we have a huge need, what we call them WASH specialists. That's water, sanitation, and hygiene. And this is often people that are water engineers, or they have some kind of technical functionality that they've been doing for the government or for another organization. I mean, there's no end to the needs for that. And of course, the talent pool for that is quite small. So there's actually a specific talent pool for UNHCR, like that you can, fill out. And yeah, I'm sure if you have that kind of experience, you'd be very likely to be picked up. But there's no guarantee that you're going to be deployed to Central America. That's where it's a little bit harder with UNHCR, these big international organizations. It's kind of them that dictate the needs and where they are, and you have to kind of go along with that. Of course, you can make contact with the offices in Central America. We've definitely increased our we've hired a lot more people, and they've definitely increased in size and space and financing. But it's not so easy to get that one specific job in that one specific country. So I would say that you'd have to look out for very specific opportunities when they're advertised.
Thanks. And everyone, we have just a few minutes left, but these are such great questions. Nathan, you mentioned that when you're looking at an application, you want to see someone show a genuine interest. Can you talk about what kinds of things resonate in a motivational statement, whether it's for a job with you or with UNV, that you would recommend people put into their motivational pieces?
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. When I'm looking at a CV, I want to see the experience that you've done that's relevant. And I don't really care if it was a paid job or a volunteer experience, but the person that has sat in an HQ job or worked for a non-operational organization in a headquarters doing policy, that is almost never, for the job that I do, is going to be the person that I call on. It's really going to be the people that worked in water and sanitation in Central America, and be like, oh, this person really knows what's happening and how to do it. So those are the people that I'm going to gravitate towards as a hiring manager. But I mean, I think you can show your commitment to refugees by the breadth of your work experience. And if your work isn't related to refugees, but you wanted to get into that, that's where volunteering you could highlight, although I work for USAID and I don't work with refugee populations, I am volunteer and spend my time doing this with refugees. So then you're marrying the experience with the commitment, and that's a really winning combination.
And I know we have so many great questions, so folks have a couple extra minutes, and Nathan in particular, if you do, we can stay on.
I do, yeah. I have no.
I also know that UNV has an online component to supporting programs and projects. How does that usually weigh into the consideration process?
I actually have never worked with one of the remote UNVs. I've never done, I know it exists. I haven't seen it. I mean, oftentimes for UNHCR in particular, it is really on the ground stuff. So I mean, I don't know the circumstances whereby they would contract a remote volunteer. I mean, now everybody's a remote volunteer. So I mean, there's that. And that maybe will make the office more willing to look into those, but it's really a kind of an old-fashioned humanitarian organization where people are really focused on the ground, what to do, and how you're doing it there. I definitely, for some expert positions, they might do that under consultancy instead of a UNV. So I actually don't really know how that functions. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. And you touched on this briefly, but much of the IGO system and the UN system is about, you need the experience to get the experience, and then you need it to get it in that constant revolving conundrum. Could you talk a little bit more about how you find these opportunities, especially if few of them are publicly posted, and again, good ways to build that skill set locally? And I know you've touched on this a little bit, but I think folks are still worried about that chicken and egg scenario. So if you could unpack that a little bit more, we'd really appreciate it.
Sure. I mean, it is absolutely a chicken and egg scenario, and it's the age-old conundrum, and it exists. You cannot work for the UN until you've worked for the UN. So how do you do it? I mean, really, my answer to that is volunteer. find a way to volunteer in a parallel institution that gives you the same skill set that you would get from an internship. And a lot of like in the United States, a lot of domestic resettlement agencies or organizations that work with migrants or refugees, like you can start building that. So I would definitely say volunteering is the way to get it on your CV, and that can parlay into the experience, because that way you're getting the experience, and that can help you to get the actual branding of the internship. Networking, like there's a lot of fancy people that go to these schools, so find them, find who their parents are, and just like get informational interviews, talk to them about their experience, what is required, and try and network your way into it. I mean, for Ethiopia, like I didn't apply for anything. Like I literally wrote a random email to the office. Now that will like not work 99% of the time, but you have to kind of you have to pursue your own agenda. You can't really sit around and wait for those advertised positions. Like you have to see what exists. And oftentimes there'll be a hiring manager and they're like, oh yeah, actually I have a budget for an intern and I didn't think about it, and this person looks great, like let's try and get the process. Now that it's paid internships, there's a little bit more process around that, I would say, which is both great thing and it's also unfortunate. This is a little bit less of the Wild West. But yeah, I mean, I would just continue to look around, and also reach out to the country office directly, or if you know somebody that works there, a friend that's worked there, like find a way to find out what's coming. And I would definitely say, like, in the field experience is always going to be, like, I've seen so many people that were so excited for their headquarters like internship, and it's it can really be a mixed bag, and you can spend your whole time like making photocopies or like doing one specific thing, and like in the field, like they're like, you're a warm body, like let's go, like you're going to do all of this stuff. And so I got a huge level of experience working in the field that you would just never have gotten in HQ. And I mean, not to say that there can't be opportunities from HQ, but unless you're really a specialist in some very specific thing, I've often seen those internships not parlay into a career. Like it's more frustrating for people, and they're not able to get jobs afterwards because they're not getting the raw skill set where the entry level jobs are. We don't have like very many entry level jobs, writing policy notes in Geneva. Like we have entry level jobs like doing refugee registration. Like now they're probably hiring a bunch of people in Sudan because they need people to manage the influx from Ethiopia. So, you have to think really strategically. Maybe the internship in Geneva feels more prestigious or something, but in fact, it's not really going to set you up in the same way that field experience does.
Sounds like, unfortunately, also just watching the news and seeing where the hotspots are is going to help you gain some market intel as to where the jobs might be emerging. So we have one we have one last pretty technical question, and then but first I want to thank absolutely everybody for being here. Nathan, this was amazing wisdom. Thank you so much. And the recording, unless I've screwed it up, will be available on the APSIA YouTube page afterwards. And I make no promises that I have not screwed it up. So the last question we had for you, Nathan, was about the relationship between UNHCR and OCHA. But we had another one earlier about sort of the transferability between different UN agencies. So if you would answer that specifically, but also UNHCR more broadly in the UN family, that'd be great.
UNHCR and OCHA. Well, there's an interesting question. Yes, we work together. And, I mean, the reality is like UN agencies are competitors with one another. And oftentimes you can feel like in some situations you can feel that. OCHA in general, I mean, from the refugee perspective, for a refugee emergency, like OCHA is like it's UNHCR, we have the mandate. It's in a humanitarian situation, like in a situation of IDPs, OCHA is the coordinating actor, and UNHCR has a specific role to manage the protection cluster. And so there the roles are defined. So I mean, globally, there's a structure in place, but in reality, I mean, there is a little bit of, people are competing against one another. But I mean, OCHA doesn't do direct services, so it's not the same as like UNHCR might have more of a competition with IOM, say, or sometimes with UNICEF. OCHA, I think a lot of the UN agencies, they're not delivering the same direct services, so it's less of an issue. But yeah, I mean, and overall, it's actually, you would imagine that there's a lot of movement between UN agencies and that there's skill sets that would work for both. it doesn't happen very often. And there's a little bit of people are very interested in their own tribe of people that come with their skill sets. There are exceptions, of course, and I worked for UNICEF for a year. There's ways to get in and out, but it's not as easy as one would imagine or hope for, you know, the delivering as one and all of those kind of things. So the reality is that it can be tricky. Now, if you have a technical skill set, if you're the water sanitation engineer, that's really easy to do. Like, because those, every agency is desperate for those people, and you know there's always a need. So my friends that do have that profile have often worked for the World Food Program, UNHCR, UNICEF, big international NGOs, and they kind of move around between all of them. Or also shelter can be a really technical skill set where people move around to both. But yeah, it doesn't happen that often. And even for me to get the job with UNICEF and have like the interagency transfer, it was such a pain, honestly. So I think that there's some people that are trying to change that, but it's not easy.
Thank you so much. And as a reminder to everybody, just for fun, every UN agency has their own application process and application website and JPO website and all of those things. So when class gets boring, don't tell your staff I said this. You can just skim the sites and go from there. So now we're both getting in trouble, Nathan. Isn't this wonderful?
Hey, if I'm going down, you need to come down with me. So I'm happy for that.
Sounds like a fun place to be. Thank you so much, Nathan. This was wonderful and amazing. Thank you to all of our students for joining us today and the staff. We look forward to seeing you at future APSIA career webinars. And if you missed some of the past ones, they're all also on our YouTube page, all the ones we were allowed to record. And we look forward to seeing all of you at future events. And thank you again, Nathan. SIPA should be very proud of all of the amazing work that you do, and I'm sure that they are. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day wherever you find yourself. Stay safe.
Thank you.